Thank you, Steve. I'm speaking to you from Zurich. It's late afternoon here, 5:30, dark, um, and sort of a beginning of the Christmas season type day. Very pleasant. The streets are crowded. Lots of people shopping this afternoon, Saturday afternoon. And I'd like to begin by saying a few words about the performance of the Jung-White letters. What you see on the DVD is a performance based on a script that was derived from the book that Steve mentioned. It's called the Jung-White Letters. It's a correspondence between Victor White and C.G. Jung that took place between 1945 and 1960. It's a performance. That is, it is a dramatic representation of a text. And actually, I got the idea for doing a performance of these letters from one of my teachers and friends in Chicago, Lee Roloff, who was a professor of performing arts at Northwestern University for many years. And at one point in Chicago, this was in the 1980s, I believe, Lee and Roland Rude and Roland's wife, Mary Lou Rude, put together and staged a performance of the Freud-Jung letters. So that's the background of this performance. It's where the idea came from originally. One of Lee's very well-known, in theater circles at least, students at Northwestern was Mary Zimmerman. And she became very well known in Chicago and New York for staging texts like Leonardo's notebooks and Proust's Remembrance of Things Past. So that's the idea of a performance, a text performance. You take a text and from it you derive a performance script and then you enact it. And it really brings it to life. Those of you who've seen the performance on DVD, I'm sure, have the impression that you've actually been with these two men. The players, the performers of this, I'll tell you about in a moment, are actually Jungian analysts. They're not professional actors, but you'd think they were. The skill that they bring to these roles is quite extraordinary. And by the time this DVD was made, they played the parts for quite a number of times, and in Zurich and London and other places. And so they're well practiced and really, I think, bring those characters to life. The way we created the script was interesting as well. This book was published several years before we began working on this. It was actually published in 2007, so not so long ago. Shortly before it was published, we started working on a script, or shortly after it was published, with Ann Lammers, who is the editor of the book. And she plays the role of the narrator in the performance, putting the pieces together. We took these 300-odd pages of text, and we each read through them, and we asked the question, which of these letters are must-haves, which would be optional, which can we let go in order to create a performance? And as we sorted through and thought about it and talked about it over several months, we came upon the idea of really focusing on the relationship between two men, their friendship, and the course that that friendship takes over a period of years. So we focused mostly on the personal elements in the letters, and we cut away a lot of the other, what we considered by that time, peripheral material. Actually, it's not at all peripheral. From another point of view, the intellectual content of their letters is enormous. And the rigor and sophistication with which they address difficult, complex theological and psychological issues is really astonishing. We don't write letters normally like that anymore in our day of emails and notes and so on. These are letters that these two men put an enormous amount of energy and time and effort into writing. So in our creation of a script, we had to pare away a lot of otherwise very important, very interesting material to get to the bones of their relationship. And what we discovered in doing that was a really powerful and poignant story, a dramatic story of the course of a relationship from a beginning to a middle to an end. And that's really what we focused on in the script and in trying to create the story within the letters, or the story behind the letters. Let me just say a word about the players. The role of Victor White is performed by John Hill. And some of you know John Hill from one of the Four Pillars sessions that we had on this network some while back. He accompanied me, and we discussed the interpretation of dreams in Jungian analysis and psychotherapy. And John Hill is a training analyst at ISAP, and one of the favorite lecturers here, because he is a very personable and warm and friendly sort of personality that people like to listen to, and he really gives himself fully to his subjects and to his lectures and seminars. He's Irish in background. He actually first discovered Jung by reading Victor White, interestingly enough, when he was studying. He was taking a course in religious studies at American University, or a Catholic University in Washington, D.C. When he was a young man, he started reading Jung, and he came to Zurich and trained about the same time I did, in the late 60s, early 70s. And he picks up the role of Victor White and bought himself a white collar and creates a very convincing persona of the priest, Victor White. Paul Bruce, also a training analyst at ISAP, plays the role of C.G. Jung. And he's a perfect actor for the role, I think, because he's also from Basel. That's where Jung spent his youth. Jung grew up in Basel, went to school there, went to the university there, studied medicine before he came to Zurich, and studied psychiatry. And Paul Bruce, when he first came on stage, the first time we did the performance here in Zurich, and he opened his mouth and he said, Dear Father White. Everybody in the audience broke up with laughter because they recognized the Basler accent to perfection. And so the voice that you hear in this performance is very close to Jung's voice. Maybe not the tonal quality so much, but the accent in English is absolutely perfect. Pitch perfect. And so you'll come away from the experience of the performance really with the impression of having heard Jung speak to you, speak to Victor. My dear Father White, he says, they have a deep guttural sound in the back of their throat when they pronounce the R's. And it's very amusing when you first hear it, very convincing. And one of the discoveries that we made as we went through these letters was that there was a strong feminine element that represented itself, an eros element, let's say. The eros between two men, John Beebe has often said, is the anima, the eros that passes between two men in a close and intimate relationship, which is what Jung and Victor White did develop. Is the anima between them, and this anima figure pops up in the course of their correspondence in the form of a friend of Victor White's, an English woman, married, living in London, with whom he had some discussions, some contacts, and I think she told him her dreams and shared her journals and so on. And her name was Barbara Robb. And at one point, she sent Victor White some dreams that she had of Jung. She had been reading Jung. She had never met Jung. She dreamed of Jung. And then she did some active imaginations in which Jung played a role. And she sent that material to Victor White, and Victor White passed it on to Jung. And Jung became fascinated by this material as well. And at one point, actually, this isn't in the performance, but it is in the letters, she did come to Zurich and she visited with Jung, and he writes some humorous letters back to Victor White about his impressions of Barbara Raab. They refer to her as the Soror Mystica, and that role is played by Heike Weiss. She is a psychiatrist and an analyst, training analyst also at ISAP, and I think she plays the role of the Soror Mystica to perfection as well, very convincing in that role. And then finally Anne Lammers, who plays the role of the narrator and strings the pieces together. Because we had to jump through the text, she creates the storyline so that you can follow the development that happens between the letters that we've selected. So in making the selection, we followed the line of the relationship, that vertex, and then we focused on one of the major intellectual issues that come up in the letters, one of the theological issues that was very important to them and really was at the crux of their debate and their argument, finally their break, and that is the doctrine of evil that the Roman Catholic Church has held for centuries. Victor White speaks for and Jung objects to strenuously. It's referred to as the doctrine of privatio boni. Privatio boni is Latin for privation of good, that evil does not exist in itself. Essentially, there's no such thing as evil. It is simply the absence of good or the denial of good. So that essentially everything that is good. But if you take something away from that good, or you turn away from that good, or you reject that good, evil comes into being. And so the reason that the Catholic theologians have insisted on this doctrine has to do with the view that God is the summum bonum, all good, and that an all good God existing and is all powerful and all knowing does not have any evil in him, so and only what he is exists essentially, and so that evil does not have any existence outside of God and does not have any ontological or metaphysical standing of its own. And Jung objected to this for his own reasons, for psychological reasons, and they wrestle with this subject through many letters, and it gets very complicated and very convoluted, and tremendous misunderstandings between them until they finally just have to drop the subject. They never can resolve that one. And we had quite a bit about privatio boni in the first rendition of this script, and we did a rehearsal and had an expert theater person come in and give us some advice about how to improve the performance. And he said, "Oh, privatio boni, forget that stuff. Nobody understands it or cares about it anyway. Don't put so much privatio boni in there." He got very irritated. So we dropped some of that, and we tried to explain it in the performance. What is it that they're really talking about, this privatio boni? They go into Greek and Latin and Thomas Aquinas and the patristic fathers and whatnot. And Jung takes all this very, very seriously, of course, and so does Victor White. So that's in there, and that we give that some emphasis. Now, let me just say a couple words about who was Victor White. You all, I'm assuming, know more or less who C.G. Jung was, but who was Victor White? Victor White was born in 1902, so he's 27 years younger than Jung. He's a generation younger. And when they begin their correspondence in 1945, Jung just has had his 70th birthday, and Victor White is 42, I believe, or 43. And Victor White was born into a family of Anglican priests. His father was an Anglican priest. I believe his grandfather was an Anglican priest. One of his brothers became an Anglican priest. But Victor, the oldest of the three children, three boys in his family, when he was an adolescent, I guess probably out of rebellion against his father, decided to join the Roman Catholic Church. And he entered into the training for the priesthood at a very early age, and with a kind of romantic view of what Roman Catholicism was all about. he hadn't grown up in the church. He didn't know Catholic culture really, but there was a kind of throwback to medieval romanticism, that the church was a place of absolute certainty and security, and wonderful stained glass windows and all the beautiful saints. And the really true church was the Catholic Church, and it was with that kind of attitude that he went into the church and into his training. And while he was studying in his early years, studying philosophy and theology, he decided to become a Dominican priest. That's a particular, very strong, very powerful order in the Catholic Church, and noted for its high intellectual accomplishments and rigor. And Victor White became an expert in the philosophy and theology of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is the great theologian of the Catholic Church from the 13th century. He himself was a Dominican also, and so as Victor White entered into this order, he really got caught up in the theology. It's called Thomism, and there are many versions of Thomism. There's Neo-Thomism, there's very traditional Thomism. And Thomas Aquinas' idea was that philosophy can be used by theology to a certain point, that philosophy, the natural sciences, what humans can discover by themselves, by their reasoning, by their own intellectual efforts, can take us a long ways toward the truth, but it can't get us all the way there. So he called philosophy and the natural sciences the handmaiden of theology. Theology is based, however, on revelation, and revelation is not derived from human reason. It's derived from the ultimate, from God. God gives the truth to the church in this case, or to the biblical writers, to the apostles, and so on. And that revelation takes us beyond what human beings can know on their own steam, on their own power. And but he was open to what human knowledge can offer, as long as it doesn't contradict revelation. And so he created a kind of synthesis. His great philosopher was Aristotle. And so his theology uses Aristotle to a certain point, and to kind of rationalize theology, put it into good order and make it reasonable and logical. But it doesn't. But theology is not grounded in reason. And so Victor White learned this philosophy and theology very well, taught it, was teaching it in Oxford at Blackfriars, when he had an existential crisis. He started doubting. He started having questions about theology, and he found it less and less interesting to teach, and he went into a kind of depression. And around 1938, 1940, he really was considering leaving the church. He didn't know if he could teach it anymore. He really was burned out. He was very tired of teaching the same thing year after year. It wasn't very creative for him anymore. And at that point, he was introduced to Jungian psychology. And he went into analysis with a Jungian in Oxford named John Layard. And this really restored his soul, gave him a new kind of vibrancy and vitality, looking at his own dreams, discovering himself. He really discovered his subjectivity. When you study a subject like theology, everything's out there. It's all references. It's all done already. You have to learn it and repeat it. And once you've done that, it loses its interest and its value. What he discovered in working with Layard was his own subjectivity. He discovered the psyche. He also had a soul, and he had dreams, and this really refreshed and revivified him, and so he became excited, very interested in psychology. Years later, he confessed, speaking about this crisis, in a lecture that he gave, I believe it was in California or New York, or in San Francisco in late 1954. He says, "I am by profession a theologian, but I am a theologian to whom something happened. Suddenly, or perhaps not so suddenly, theology ceased to have any meaning for me at all. And he's talking about this period around 1940. Theology ceased to have any meaning for me at all. I could not get my mind onto it or anything to do with it except with horror, boredom, and loathing. And so this is a burned out man, and who really needs some the water of life. He needs to enter into a Jungian analysis, and he found a pretty good analyst in John Layard. I think it really worked for him, and he started to read Jung, and so he could take a new approach to theology as well, and to the scriptures. And he again became a very alive and vital teacher, now giving new kinds of interpretation to the old material. And after this crisis, and more or less passed, he stayed a priest, continued to have crises of faith and doubt, as you will see in the performance. There's another moment when he feels like he just cannot go on anymore. This is about 1953 or so, 1952, 1953. He had another crisis, and Jung urges him to hang in there and to continue working, not to run away from himself and from his problems. And so he remains a priest to the end of his life, but really became more of a Jungian analyst than a theologian in his later years. After he started his correspondence with Jung in 1945, Jung very quickly took him into his inner circle, and people were surprised at how easily Victor White was brought into the closest intimate contact with Jung. In fact, there was a lot of jealousy and envy and rivalry, because people would have given their eye teeth to be invited out to Bollingen for a weekend to spend with Jung. And immediately after the correspondence began, Jung invited Victor White to spend 2 weeks, solid 2 weeks, with him in Bollingen, discussing theology and psychology. And Victor White writes back to him, says, "This is my idea of heaven." He couldn't believe how Jung was receiving him. And I think the second letter that Jung wrote to him, he says, "You are my white raven," playing on his name, White. And Jung had been waiting for a theologian, and for a masterful theologian, a top first-class theologian, and he thought he really found that one in this Oxford scholar, this Dominican priest, Victor White. Victor White was extremely intelligent and a rigorous thinker, and with a superb education in his area. And so Jung was also eager to make contact with him and to have these dialogues. And then, in fact, when the Jung Institute in Zurich was founded in 1947, Jung sponsored White as one of the founding members of the Jung Institute, put him right in the middle of the structure, the power structure, and so I think White felt very blessed in those early years. And when you look at this relationship as it developed, you could say between 1945 and 1948, that early period, it really was a honeymoon period for both of them. They were getting to know each other. White, after the war had ended, now had access to all of Jung's works. He could read them. He could talk to Jung about them. They went back and forth. Every year he came to Bollingen and visited with him. Jung brought him into the Eranos conferences in Ascona in August. Every year Jung was there between 1933 and 1953 or 4, something like that. And so he brought him right beside him. And Victor White really benefited from that and thrived, and felt that he had really landed in an ideal spot for himself. But that honeymoon period started fading around 1948, when Victor White really started addressing the hard subjects that would come up between them, where Jung's psychology and traditional Catholic theology really do not see eye to eye. Jung was you could say, a post-Christian man. He looked on Christian religion as more or less having run its course unless it could really transform itself and integrate what it had rejected and repressed, the shadow and the feminine. Unless it could do that, Jung felt it really was, it had lived for 2,000 years and it had run its course and it was more or less at its end. He was post-mythological in his thinking. He was post-theological. He really was a psychologist. And so he would take the doctrines of the church very seriously, but he sees them as archetypal images. He sees them as manifestations of the human psyche. He doesn't see them as ultimate truth. And Victor White, coming from theology and from revelation and from Thomism, got into serious struggles because Jung was interpreting, for instance, the doctrine of God very differently from the way the Catholic Church puts forward the revelation of the reality of God. Jung wanted to see, the God image as a polarity, a combination of the opposites: masculine, feminine, good, evil. And of course, the traditional Catholic Church would have nothing to do with that. That was heresy, anathema. And so Victor White started bringing up these subjects, and in some letters he would start correcting Jung and saying that Jung was making mistakes. In some letters he said that, or in some of his critiques, he said that Jung had the theological understanding of a kindergartner, or he didn't know the first thing about serious theology. And of course, Jung took great offense at this, and then they had their arguments, and in the end they ended up really kind of hurting each other's feelings as well as disagreeing intellectually. It became I'd say the period from 1948 to 1955 is serious dialogue, and that ends with a kind of rancorous break after Jung's outrageous book, in White's view, outrageous book, Answer to Job, was published and translated into English, and Victor White had to answer people's questions. What does Jung mean by this sentence and that sentence? Made him very uncomfortable as a Catholic priest, and so he wrote a very, very nasty, vituperative, angry review of Answer to Job in the Blackfriars magazine, and Jung read that and was seriously wounded by some of the things that Victor White was saying. And so over Answer to Job, they really had more than a serious dispute. I think they had a falling out. But it was not the kind of falling out that Jung had with Freud, where, as Jung says in his last letter to Freud, quoting Shakespeare's Hamlet, "The rest is silence." It wasn't quite like that. It wasn't total silence, because there was a resumption of some correspondence and some contact after 1955. Emma Jung died in 1954. That was more or less the end of Victor White's regular visits to Jung's home and to Zurich, and Victor White spent several years then in America, in California. John Giannini met him at that time, I believe, in Oakland, California, where Victor White had his residence and was teaching, and was very well known at that time as a Jungian analyst and a priest, and a very fine thinker on this in the area of psychology and religion. And Victor White did publish another book after this break with Jung, Psyche and Soul, and really Victor White got into a lot of trouble with the Catholic Church because of his Jungianism. Victor White says in that book, and he really held that what the Christian Church and what the Catholics mean by soul is really the same thing that White and that Jung and the depth psychologists mean by psyche. We're talking about the same area. We're talking about the same reality. We may look at it in different ways. We may think about it in different ways, but we're talking about the same thing. And so there is a common ground. And the conservative theologians in the Catholic Church forced White to discontinue publishing some of his books. God in the Unconscious was taken off the market. He had to withdraw it. They gave him a very hard time in the late 50s, before the Catholic Church became somewhat liberalized after Vatican II. it went through a very severe conservative period, and Victor White was really caught in that. So he was in a very uncomfortable position, even though he remained a Catholic priest to the end of his life, and he died rather young in 1960 at the age of 58 of stomach cancer after having had a motor scooter accident in which the wind, which appears prominently in one of his early dreams that he sends to Jung, the wind blew him off his motorcycle and he hurt his head badly. He never did quite recover from that, and then he was diagnosed with stomach cancer and he died on May 22nd, 1960. And there is a brief exchange of letters between White and Jung in those last months of White's life. I'm going to end this introduction by quoting from a wonderful essay by Adrian Cunningham, who knew Victor White and wrote a memoir about Victor White that's included as an appendix in the Jung-White letters. And he concludes his essay with these lines. He says, "White died on 22nd May 1960. Lucid until the end, his last words were, 'God, take me.' After the funeral at St. Dominic's in London, he was buried at Woodchester, where he had entered the order 36 years earlier. In a subsequent letter, Elkich, a friend of his, wrote that somewhere he had read words which he never forgets, in which Jung said, quote, 'I have a huge correspondence, see innumerable people, but have only two real friends with whom I can speak about my own difficulties. The one is Erich Neumann, and he lives in Israel. The other is Father Victor White in England.'" So I think that gives you an impression of the feeling that Jung had for Victor White. I think he was very attached to him. He really loved him, and I think it was very hurtful the way their relationship went in the later years. But at the end, there was a kind of reconciliation. So it wasn't a complete break. It wasn't tragic in the sense that it might have been. And Victor White continued to function as a Jungian analyst and as a priest to the end of his career and his life in 1960. So that's what I have as an introduction. So maybe now, Steve, we could begin with the questions and the discussion among the participants.
Thank you. I'm just interested in what you would cite as the personal development during the period that Jung and White were not in communication, that 4 or 5 year period when Victor White was ill and Jung was silent to his to what was going on. What kind of chronology can you give us about what was happening with each of those men intellectually, or what were they writing, what were they producing?
Oh, sure. That would be about 1955 to 1960, in that period. Of course, Jung was 80 years old in 1955, and his health was not very good. In fact, in the letters, you see many, many references to his bad health. He had a heart attack in 1944, and after that, he had to be very careful. He didn't travel very much. He had several heart problems and infarcts and so on during the correspondence. But as he says in one of early letters to Victor White, as he's recovering from a heart attack, I think this is 1946 or so, he says, my strength is very low, but I still see flickers of lightning on the horizon. I think there's still something going on in the psyche. And he had a tremendous productivity after that. When you think of what he wrote after 1945, 1946, it's astonishing. It's some of his greatest work. He wasn't seeing patients anymore, so he spent a lot of time doing research. 1955, he published Mysterium Conjunctionis. So that would be roughly the beginning of the separation with Victor White. Emma Jung had died, Tony Wolfe had died in 1952, Jung was surrounded by people who loved him, were taking care of him. Ruth Bailey was taking care of him in his home. And he had many students who were fighting to see him as much as they could. I think his last works were during that period. He wrote an essay on flying saucers, which is very interesting. A new myth for our time. Flying saucers. He was very interested in researching what do people see when they say they observe flying saucers. And so he remained curious until the very end. He wrote his autobiography with Anila Yaffe in those years, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. The first 2 or 3 chapters he sat down and wrote out by hand. He said that as he did that, he imagined that he was speaking to an audience, and in the front row of the audience were sitting his grandchildren and his children. He was telling them about his childhood. And so he put himself back into his childhood in those years, and it was a very powerful experience for him to review his life. And so I think these last years for Jung were also a kind of reviewing, a looking back on who he had been as a child, as a young person, those first chapters of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, looking back on his period with Freud and so on. Also, he started to finish the Red Book. Now, the Red Book has just been published to great acclaim and all kinds of hoopla and brouhaha in New York a couple of weeks ago. And it's on display in a museum in New York. And toward the end, in those years, I think around 1958 or so, he decided to try to finish the Red Book. He just abruptly stopped in 1928. He didn't write anymore. It stops more or less in midstream. So he sat down and he tried to finish it. So he started writing and wrote out a few pages. He didn't get very far in that. But he wanted to finish it up. So he's in a period now of finishing things and reviewing. And then the very last thing that he wrote was still working on, I think the day or two before he died, was the essay on dreams that is in the first chapter in Man and His Symbols. And I think that was also a review of his views on dreams, the interpretation of dreams, and it's a very interesting, very, very late work. So he continued growing and thinking and as I said, reviewing right up to the end of his life. And I think he even had some important dreams right toward the end that Mary Louise von Franz talks about or writes about somewhere. Victor White also continued working. After the break, he didn't renounce his Jungianism. He continued working as a Jungian analyst. I think he probably continued working on himself. I don't know. He didn't leave much behind in the way of diaries and personal writings, but he was invited to give a series of lectures that became Psyche and Soul, his last book. That was published, I think, 1958 or 1959. And then he, several weeks before he died, he was supposed to give a talk at the Psychological Club in London, and he was working on a paper on the self. So his views, he continued developing his views. He continued thinking about the relation of psychology and religion. And I think if he had lived another 20 years, he died, as I said, at the age of 58, very young, compared to Jung, who died at 86. If he'd lived Jung's life as long as Jung did, and had the benefit of Vatican II, can you imagine? I mean, the life and vitality that would have given him. It would have opened up a whole new world of possibilities and thinking. He wouldn't have been so afraid to cross swords with these very conservative, tough, mean guys at the Vatican. And he would have been in a much more hospitable Catholic environment. So I think he would have written a lot more, and I think he would have made a major contribution to Jungian psychology. which in a sense remains to be made, although there nowadays, since his death, there are a lot of books on psychology and religion from a Jungian perspective. And unfortunately, Victor White's work is not referenced very much. It should be. The problem with it is, I think it was written during a time of such conservatism in the Catholic Church, and he had to be very careful not to offend the authorities. And so he really couldn't let himself fly. He couldn't let his mind really expand to the extent that he was capable of. I think he had tremendous potential. That's the tragedy of Victor White. I think that he was locked into a very narrow conservative religious system, and that really limited him and caused great suffering on his part, which you see in many of the letters, that he was not comfortable in the position, although he really was a priest. He was a very spiritual man, but the church was very mean at that time, and he suffered greatly from it.
Yeah, see, we're all set. We've got the pictures and everything, and we do have a couple of questions, so we'll start with one. Jung suggests that the issue of good and evil is to be resolved in the age of the Holy Spirit. Would Dr. Stein care to comment on that?
That reference rings some bells with me, but I can't remember exactly where Jung talks about that. I think what he's thinking of there is, he's a dialectical thinker, and he's sometimes been compared to Hegel, who was the great philosopher of dialectics. The opposites. There's a thesis, an antithesis, and then a third synthesis that rises above the pair of opposites and creates a new form or a new resolution that then produces another thesis and antithesis. This is how history moves forward. And Jung was that kind of thinker. He thought in terms of a dialectic. Also, in the psychology, there's a movement from unconscious to consciousness, and then consciousness has to grapple with the unconscious, and so there's a polarization between the two, and out of that polarization there emerges the transcendent function, which bridges the opposition between conscious and unconscious, provides a symbol that then can carry the psyche forward. That's his idea of psychological growth and development. And so if he puts that into these theological terms, you have this opposition between good and evil, two sides of God as he would see it. There's a good son and a bad son, a good father and a bad father, something like that, or a masculine and a feminine element. With regard to good and evil, Victor White at one point accuses him of being a dualist. Okay, and this, of course, is an ancient heresy in the Christian Church. It was rejected by the Church Fathers, and they said there isn't a good God and a bad God. That's Zoroastrianism or something. We just believe in one God, and that is a good God. So Victor White accuses Jung of being a dualist, and Jung writes back and he says, I'm absolutely not a dualist. Dualism is at the heart of the Christian Church. You've got a Satan there, and Satan is going to live in hell for eternity. That's the dualism. I'm not a dualist. I believe in the unity of the self, he said. I believe that, and this is shown by mandalas. Jung's fixation on the mandala is because he saw it as a representation, an empirical representation of the unity of the psyche. And so he says, I'm not a dualist. I believe in unity of the psyche, but there are tensions between opposites within this unity, or polarities. And when these polarities begin working against each other, there's an intense polarization. You get severe conflict. You have to hold the tension of the conflict, and out of that emerges a third thing. So in the history of the development of Christian doctrine, you have the emergence of the doctrine of the Trinity. So how did that come about? Well, first you have the period of the Father. That's number one. Father, that's the Old Testament, the Yahweh, and out of that comes the two, the Father's Son, and they stand in a relation to each other, and then out of that two emerges the third, which unites the two. That's the Holy Spirit. And so in this in this development of the doctrine of the Trinity, you have, as Jung writes about it in his essay on the Trinity, you have this dialectical movement toward a resolution. From the one comes the two, and out of the two comes the three, which is the one. Maria Prophetessa, he was so fond of quoting the alchemist. And so the age of the Holy Spirit would be one in which there is not a collapse of the difference between good and evil, but a resolution of them that holds them within a container that's large enough to manage both sides of this, and lift it up into another type of wholeness. So they aren't absolute opposites, they're polarities within a tension of opposites or a tension of differences. And that would be the Holy Spirit, the age of the Holy Spirit. I imagine that's what he means by resolved in the age of the Holy Spirit. I have to look more closely at that particular text. The age of the Holy Spirit, of course, is also in Christian theology. One of the medieval theologians, Fiore, I can't think of his exact name, but also wrote about the age of the Holy Spirit as being an age in which the necessity for texts and for church structures and organizations would be overcome, and people, individuals, would be drawn into the spiritual life by a living spirit and not by a written text or by church authorities. The age of the Holy Spirit is an age of freedom, an age of the individual, an age in which people can individually tune in to the spiritual on their own. And of course that's what Jung foresaw coming in the future, that the need for the church and for mythological doctrines and for church organizations and structures and all that would be left behind, and the individual would be capable of tuning into the spiritual life on his or her own. And that's what he encouraged people in his practice to do through active imagination, through working with dreams, to tune into the spiritual individually, outside of traditions or outside of sacred texts. You make your own sacred text from your own inner material, and you experience the spirit and the spiritual life and the numinous individually, not handed down by authorities. And then, of course, that implies that you will experience yourself and all your polarities, your good side, your shadow side, your feminine, your masculine. All of these will come into play in this age of the individual that Jung foresaw as the future of religion on this planet.
In considering the split between Jung and White and the various Jung groups that have this splitting occurrence, can you reflect for us on this splitting phenomenon that occurs within groups and within the psyche?
The question is about the splitting phenomenon in groups and in the psyche. A lot depends on how you look at splits. I mean, there are different kinds of splitting. There's a pathological form of splitting that's familiar to us as psychotherapists, with borderline patients and so on. You split good and bad and identify with good and hate bad, and the world isn't black and white like my tie. you don't see reality very clearly if you split, holding the opposites together, seeing complexity, tolerating ambiguity, all of that we take to be virtues and signs of mental health and maturity. So splitting is usually seen as a bad thing. On the other hand, there is a kind of splitting that's really a sort of differentiation and a sorting out, so that what you put together at the beginning in the honeymoon phase all looks very harmonious and very compatible. But the further you go into the relationship or into the discussion, let's say, the more you realize that these really are quite different, and maybe there is no common ground. Maybe there are such differences that you can't really at least stay in that form of union that you've had. And this is often brought to psychoanalysis, which is split into so many schools. Freud and Jung is just one example of the splitting or the differentiation within the whole field of psychoanalysis. There are many, many different variations. There are the Lacanians, and there are the Kleinians, and there are the Jungians and the Freudians, and blah, blah, blah. Each one holding on to a kind of basic set of concepts and teachings. And what this has done over the years is really you could say it's created a burgeoning of growth, like a tree with many branches. It didn't grow the way Freud would have liked it. One branch, one tree, one stem, one branch, like a pine tree or something. It grew like this, with limbs going out in all kinds of directions. And the reason for that was that there were really fundamental incompatibilities between the way Freud and Jung, for example, saw the psyche. If you look at Jung's writings before he met Freud and after he left Freud, you can see that really what he does after he leaves Freud is goes back and picks up what he had left behind during his Freudian phase. So going into his Freudian phase, he could go so far, and then he started discovering differences and incompatibilities, and finally they couldn't contain that within their relationship. The differences were too great, and so they went, I think, too far, probably tragically, so far apart that they wouldn't speak to each other again. That didn't really happen with Victor White and Jung. White continued as a Jungian, kept using Jung's the texts that he liked, kept teaching Jung and doing his work in psychology and religion over there, and Jung kept doing his work over here, and there was some correspondence between them. But I think what they discovered was just some basic differences. In one letter, White says, we come from different philosophical schools. Jung's background was in continental philosophy, Kant and the German psychologists, and just a very different approach to philosophy and metaphysics from what White had grown up with in the church and with Thomism and the whole metaphysical system of an understanding that he invested so much in and really drank deeply of, and was quite committed to it in a fundamental way. So their paths had to diverge, unless they would just say, well, let's just let it go and be friends. But these are two men who are intent on thinking, and they can't, thinking is too important for them. They can't just let it go and well, let's go for a sail and have a beer together. Just wouldn't work with them. And then when you get to the Jungian communities and you see splits and differences, there are many different reasons for those. In London, there are 4 schools, for example. 4 Jungian societies, 5 actually, 4 in the IAP and 1 outside the IAP, and each one is a little bit different. And the reasons for the splitting were partly personality conflicts, but partly differences of approach? Do you see patients on the couch 4 times a week and do reductive analysis and talk about their childhood all the time and analyze the transference in great detail? Or do you do a Zurich classical style analysis twice a week, face to face, looking at symbols and archetypal material that come up in dreams and doing active imagination? 2 very different approaches in London. One was Michael Fordham, the other was Gerhard Adler. And at one point, they couldn't bridge that difference in one society. Training requirements going this way or that way were different. They basically would have 2 groups within the same society. So I don't look on that as necessarily a bad thing. It's a differentiation of the field. And at some point, maybe some of these parts can come back together in a conversation at another level, which I think is happening throughout psychoanalysis nowadays, with Jungians talking to some Freudians and learning from them, and some Freudians beginning a little bit at least to read some Jungians. And I think the points of contact are appearing and are very fruitful, and certainly in the Jungian literature, when you read the journal articles and so on, you see references to a lot of neo-Freudian and modern psychoanalytic writers and thinkers, and they offer us a lot. So I think it's part of the historical process, this splitting and differentiation. And while it's very painful sometimes, and on a personal level, even traumatic, it's probably just a necessary part of the evolution of a field.
Yeah, hi, Murray. One of the things that strikes me, Karen Armstrong's recent books are saying that religion always had the components of logos, reason, and mythos, mystery. And it seems to me that in the dialogue between these 2 wonderful people is that they were so hung into reason that they couldn't get to the mythos part. Even the Thomistic stuff is so highly reasonable, and that so part of my question is where were these 2 people touching base with the mystery in a practical, experienced way? And it seems to me that underlying a lot of Jung's stuff is that he thought the church was going down the drain because it had lost the experience of the divine. And so if you could comment on that.
I've read some of Karen Armstrong, and I'm also taken with that idea of logos and mythos. And logos explains things and gives rational arguments, and mythos creates images and symbols, and religion is made up of both of these. Theology is probably mostly logos, theologos, the logos of God. But it's based on mythology, or it's based on image and symbol. And I think that's also true of Jung's psychology. I think Jung came to his deepest and earliest, most primary experiences, let's say, of the reality of the psyche, as he sometimes calls it, the reality of the psyche, through mythos, through an experience of image, symbol, dream, active imagination, vision. That's what the Red Book's all about. And I think what the Red Book is really his one of his earliest accounts of his primary experience of the psyche. And in that experience of the psyche, he found that, I mean, it was a combination of symbol, visionary experience, sometimes language, sometimes words coming to him, like in the 7 Sermons to the Dead, a text that almost wrote itself, painting these pictures that you'll see in the Red Book, discovering the mandala and what it meant for him as he was trying to solve his own inner problems. So he had his own primary original experience. And out of that experience came his logos. He worked on his experience. The Red Book is actually a redoing of something still more original in the Black Books. The original experience, the Red Book is an edited rendition and filled out somewhat logically arranged rendition of the experiences. It's already being worked on and edited, and selections are made and references added. So Logos is working on the primary experience, even in the Red Book already. And then he takes it a step further in his theoretical writings. But I think the argument with Victor White, and their deepest argument, the nature of God, which is really a mythological argument, what is God like? Is couched in Logos, but really underneath it, it's a mythos argument. What is the correct image of God? And Jung's experience was that God is this unio oppositorum, as he calls it, the union of opposites. It sometimes shows its face in a friendly way, sometimes in a very frightening antagonistic way. And he was very fond of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, because there Yahweh is much closer, you could say, to his experience of the divine than the God of the New Testament, the all-good, loving Father God. I think his experience was of a complexity, a huge force. He was very fond of Schopenhauer, Jung. He read Schopenhauer as a student, and Schopenhauer's idea of the world as will, I think, is very close to Jung's idea of the self, that the self with a big S, the creator self of everything, not just human individuals, but the reality behind everything, is this enormous force, this life force. It's a will. That for Jung is what the divine is, and this will, looked at from our point of view, is sometimes horrendous and frightening and scary, and trips us up and attacks us. What Yahweh does to Job, plays with us on the one side. On the other side, gives us wonderful things, gives us blessings, gives us meaning, gives us energy. And when he confronted Victor White, I think Victor White's problem was that he didn't have enough primary experience of the psyche. I think it was a bit thin. I don't think he could really contact the unconscious the way Jung could. And he didn't have the experience of the numinosum the way Jung did. Jung had a tremendous experience of the numinosum in that period, 1912 to 1920 or so. And out of that experience, he developed his idea of the self, that the self is a union of opposites. He developed his idea of the God image as a union of opposites. There he's making logos. He's making logos from the original mythos experience. So the argument between White and Jung was so complicated because I think they're really different. They have different God images based on Jung's experience on the one side and White's commitment to his learning and his church on the other, that he couldn't quite ever let go of completely. And why would he? Unless he had an experience like Jung's that would take him beyond what he could read about in the theology textbooks. As I say, White didn't leave much behind in the way of personal material, journals, dream journals, and so on. Adrian Cunningham had access to all that, all there is, and it's left in the archives of the Dominicans in Oxford, and he says there are journals from the years 1940 to 1942, dream journals, in which Victor White is recording his dreams and discussing them with John Layard. But after that, we don't see very much of Victor White's inner life. And we don't know to what extent he had much of an inner life. I think he was kind of trapped in his thinking function. Not altogether, but I think that was one of his problems, that he couldn't really let go enough to have the kind of experience that Jung ventured into in his great creative period early on.
We do, thanks.
Yes, Dr. Stein. Although these are two very different time periods in Jung's life, I'm interested in any similarities or parallels between Jung's strong attraction to Freud and to White, and also his breakup with them.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. When Jung met Freud, he was young, and Freud was about the same distance older from him as he was from White. So, I mean, it's with Freud, Jung, it's a father-son. Freud, father, Jung, son. With White, it's Jung's in the father position and White's in the son position. With Freud, he very similar to his take on White, he recognized a very brilliant intellect in Freud, and was very attracted to it. He said Freud was the first genius he'd ever met. And he had good teachers, and he was surrounded by very talented people, but Freud was in another class. And Jung recognized that immediately when they sat together for 13 hours in Freud's apartment in Vienna and discussed many things about psychoanalysis in the early days. The trajectory of their relationship is also somewhat similar in that it becomes very close. Jung was a little afraid of the intimacy that was developing there. In one letter to Freud, he says that he has a religious crush on him, and he's afraid of the erotic feelings that are developing toward Freud, because he said in his childhood he was once abused by an older man, so there's a kind of homophobia in his reaction to Freud in that phase. And Freud really tried to pull Jung into greater intimacy with him, to influence him, and to become his crown prince, and his carry on his project of psychoanalysis and so on. That was Freud's reason for trying to court Jung so assiduously. With the Jung and White issue, I think there might have been in the back of Jung's mind a fantasy that through Victor White, like Freud using Jung to get out of the Jewish ghetto in Vienna and into the academic and psychiatric world of Europe, I think Jung saw White as an entree into the Vatican, into the Catholic Church. And I think in some of these letters it's hinted a little bit that there was a kind of fantasy on his part that Jungian psychology would become, quote, sort of the official psychology of the Catholic Church, the way Thomas Aquinas had become the official theologian for the Catholic Church. I mean, that's a crazy fantasy from our perspective, but I'm not sure that Jung didn't harbor that somewhere, that he thought through White he would gain entrance to the very center of power in the Catholic Church and could have an influence there. Because he did have some ideas that maybe if the Catholic Church would pick up on some of his approach, some of his suggestions that to develop a theology of God as quaternity instead of Trinity, to add the fourth, the missing fourth, if the Christian tradition could do that, it would have another lease on life. And so insofar as he thought that he could bring Christianity back to life, he saw it as a very ailing, very dying tradition in his surroundings, in his culture. In Europe, the church is more or less moribund and dead. It's a museum in most places. People don't go to church very much here anymore. And so insofar as he thought that he could help treat Christianity. I wrote that was my book, The Treatment of Christianity. It might be possible to treat it through Victor White, on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think Victor White had his eye set on converting Jung to Catholicism. And there are a couple of letters that hint at that there's one letter in which, this isn't in the performance, it's in the text, Jung writes to Victor White that he had a dream in which he was in a monastery with a bunch of priests, and it was coming toward evening and there weren't enough beds, so he was offered a bed with an old monk, with an old, and the dream ends with him getting into bed with a monk. And Victor White writes back, if you read between the lines, very excited that Jung is coming so close to Catholic truth and wisdom. And I think he really thought that Jung was about to cross the line and get into bed with the Catholic Church and become a convert. Actually, John Layard did become a convert to the Catholic Church, his first analyst. I don't know if it was because of Victor White or not, but he did convert and became a faithful member of the Catholic Church. And so they sort of had their eyes set on each other, and in the shadows, let's say, how they could bring each other closer to their own views and to their own programs. The endings of these two relationships are quite different. They both ended a bit rancorously, differences of opinion, hurt feelings, but being the older figure in the Jung-White relationship, I think Jung was able to bridge the gap with White and resume. There's some correspondence toward the end of White's life when Jung finds out that he has been in an accident and he's dying. They resume. And toward the end, I think in the last letter that's quoted in a very moving letter that Paul Brüche speaks through the voice of an 85-year-old Jung in his last year, the last letter that he sends to Victor White. He thanks Victor White for all that he has learned from him. And I don't think he's being ironic or cynical. I think he really means it, that he did appreciate that relationship and that friendship, and he wanted Victor White to know that before he died. He also sent him a photograph of himself in that last letter. So the endings between these two relationships are quite different in feeling. And I think Jung did a better job than Freud did. I think Freud never could quite get over the break and reach out to the younger figure, Jung, unfortunately. It would have been nice if he had been able to do that.
There's a question here. Sorry. Talking about primary experience, what is the direct experience that is spreading now through seminars and teachings throughout North America? How does it relate to primary experience, if any?
Well, I think my hope would be that it leads people in a direction that would allow them to have their own primary experience. Primary experience is your own experience of the depths of the psyche, let's say, whether that is in a dream or in a vision or an active imagination. And I think what this teaching can do is give people a courage and some tools for beginning that journey to have their own primary experience. Ideally, you are, when you have your primary experience, you're with somebody that you can discuss it with, somebody who is at home in this territory, who has some understanding of what the psyche at that level looks like and what it means. So a Jungian psychotherapist or a Jungian analyst or just someone who is conversant or a religious director, if they aren't too dogmatic or too rigid in their theological understandings, could be of great help. But primary experience is your own immediate experience of the depths of the psyche. As we think of it, the depths of the psyche. In religious terms, they might think of it as the experience of transcendence or the divine.
In the introduction to Answer to Job, Jung makes a distinction between understanding God as image and then God as such, which he drew from his work with an understanding of Meister Eckhart, where he has 18 pages in Psychological Types, where Eckhart makes a distinction between God as humanly understood and Godhead as the mystery and the experience of the divine. And I think that that issue got all clogged up in Answer to Job itself, as well as in the argument between White and Jung, and maybe you might want to comment on that.
Yes, in these discussions, Jung always would say, I'm not talking about God, I'm talking about the God image. I'm talking about our human understanding, our human impressions, our human experience of what we call God. I'm not talking about, as you say, the Godhead, God in and of itself, himself, herself. And so in Answer to Job, Jung is really having, I think, an Auseinandersetzung, an intense dialogue and conversation with a very specific religious tradition. He's talking with the Bible. He's talking with a particular God image. He's not talking with God, the Godhead. He's not arguing with God. He's arguing with the biblical God. That's one God image among hundreds and thousands in world history and religious traditions. So he's really arguing with his tradition. He's not arguing with God. He's not angry at God. He's angry at an image of God, at the way a tradition has set up its stories about God, and he wants that to evolve. He wants that to change, and he sees some evolution in it as he looks at the God image as presented in the Bible from Genesis through Revelation, and he goes through that whole sweep, and then beyond that into the 2,000 years of Christian history since Christ's life and death. He wants. He thinks there are problems with the tradition, and what he's arguing for and what he's seeking to do is to try for a level of integration that tradition has not been able to achieve. Tradition has not been able to achieve an integration between ego and shadow, between masculine and feminine. And he thinks in order for it to survive and for the people who live within that tradition to thrive and be psychologically well and whole, the tradition needs to change. And that's what he's arguing with.
Yes. One of the members of the group perceived the following Trinity figure, which she found quite revealing. Jung representing intuition, White representing dogma, and the Solo Mystica representing the dance between intuition and dogma. The question is whether Solo Mystica actually helped White with her dance. Did she give White revealing dreams or visions like she gave Jung? Would the Solo Mystica could be considered the container? In addition, what would evil be for Jung? Would evil be an archetype in itself? And what is the relationship between evil and the individual or personal shadow?
Wow. Okay, I've got 3 minutes. Okay, the Sora Mystica was came up between the two. She was a friend of Victor White's, and how close that friendship was, I don't know. What the effect of Barbara Robb and Victor White was, I don't know. I do know that there were some very important women in his life. He was a celibate priest, a Dominican priest. At least he was not married, and but he had some close women friends. And I think they that's a side of the story that hasn't been published yet. Ann Lammers told me there are letters that are under lock and key exchanged between Victor White and some of these friends, and maybe the Dominicans will release those someday. So, and at the end of his life, he was cared for by some Jungian friends. Among them, a woman named Ginsberg, who was a Jungian, lived in London. So he had relationships with women, and I think the feminine was an important part of his life, but I don't think it went deep enough. I don't think he was able to integrate the feminine in a full-bodied way as a celibate priest. I don't know enough about his personal life, but I don't think it affected his thinking. And in the relationship with Jung, they kind of made a joke of her a little bit. I think Jung was very taken with her active imaginations and her dreams. He felt very moved, very touched by her, as you see in the performance. And I think Victor White was quite impressed by some of the synchronicities that came up around that. Incidentally, I did meet someone in London not so long ago who knew Barbara Robb and told me that she had gotten very involved in some social work activities later in her life. She was very active in promoting better care for the elderly and the handicapped, and she was a woman with a big heart and a very strong feeling function, which is exactly what Victor White, I think, needed. But whether he was able to use that or not, I don't know. What is evil for Jung, and is there an archetype of evil, and is it connected to the shadow? I don't think Jung felt that there is an archetype per se of evil, but there is a side of the self that from our point of view looks evil or destructive, but we don't know if in itself it is, if its intention is evil. Usually what we mean by evil when we speak about it in a human sense is moral evil. And Jung isn't really addressing that issue of ethics and morality with the concept of evil. What he's addressing is, I edited a book called Jung on Evil. You can read about this in the introduction I put there. He says the distinction between good and evil is a conscious distinction. It's a distinction of the ego, and it's a distinction that we all have to make. We have an ethical responsibility to distinguish between good and evil from our own limited perspectives and to do the right thing, okay? The avoidance of doing the right thing or shying away from it is our shadow business, or often it's unconscious. We do something and later regret that we did it, but while we were doing it, we weren't so aware that we were doing it. We create destruction, or we create mayhem and conflict and bad things for other people and so on. And we do it in a shadowy way, that means in an unconscious way. And it's our duty to become aware of that over time, to reflect on our mistakes, to become aware of our motives, to try to take them into conscious account before we make our decisions and so on. So I don't think Jung would say that evil is an archetype, but it is the dark side of the self. And in one place he talks about absolute evil, and I think what he means by absolute evil there is that you really look deeply into an aspect either of the ego and its selfishness and its coldness, or into a side of the self that, from our ego's point of view, from a human point of view, looks very destructive. But it really belongs, otherwise he would be a dualist. If you've got an archetype of evil and an archetype of good that are at war with each other, Victor White would be right, you're a dualist. I don't think he was. He wants to hold them together.
Hello. I see Jung and White's interaction is very Western-oriented. Did they have any Eastern philosophy involved or Eastern experiences of numinous?
There's one letter in which Jung writes about faith. he's just read Victor White's essay on gnosis, and he writes back to White and he says, I finally understand what you mean by faith, or what faith is. I would call it respect. He says, I have great respect for the Christian doctrines, but I also have great respect for Taoism. I have great respect for Buddhism. I have great respect for all the great religious traditions. And Victor White writes back and says, yes, I have respect for all of those religious traditions as well, but the Christian mythos, the Christian mythology, does not call for my respect because it's so incredible. You have a virgin birth, you have a resurrection, you have all these stories that are unrealistic and unnatural. It says that I can't respect something like that. It calls for faith, not for respect. But I can respect the teachings of Buddhism, and I can respect the play of opposites in Taoism and so on. That's the only place I know that they really touched on Eastern topics. Really, their subject was Christian theology. That was Victor White's specialty, and the doctrine of evil as privatio boni was in the center of their disputes and their discussions. And at this point in his life, Jung was really more interested in his own religious tradition, in Christianity and the biblical tradition, let's say, in a broad sense, than he was in Eastern religions anymore, although he never put them aside. But his big interest in Eastern thought had come earlier. It was in 20, 30 years earlier, when he had written about the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Secret of the Golden Flower and Kundalini Yoga and all that. Now, after about 1940, he was really focused on Christian doctrines like the Trinity, transformation symbolism and the Mass, Christian tradition, answer to Job, and so on. So that really was their topic rather than Eastern religions.
Thank you.
Victor White came from a background of a family background of theology, and I would like to know what his relationship continued to be with his family, what kind of influence they might have had on his thinking,
feedback. Perhaps I'm trying to hear enough of that.
I don't know very much about that. The only I could refer you to Adrian Cunningham's essay, the appendix in this book, where he mentions something about Victor White's family, but it never comes up in the letters between White and Jung. There's no mention that I can recall of anything about his family. I think he had a bad relationship with his father, and that's why he didn't become an Anglican priest. He went into the Roman Catholic Church instead as an act of rebellion, and to some extent I think regretted it later. But I don't know anything about his continuing ongoing relationships with his two brothers or his family. I think he was pretty much cut off from them.
The question I have is
the
wind in the dream. The dream was in the beginning of the talk, and it talked about the wind, and then you mentioned that when he got knocked over by the motorcycle, he said there's wind in it. And then what was Jung's comment to him about what the wind was? And then you mentioned the sailboat. I'm trying to help you.
Yeah, right.
You mentioned the sailboat and the importance of the sailboat. So I just think it's a powerful image. The wind also can represent the spirit.
Right.
The sailboat is very. Does that make sense?
Yes. In this last paper that Victor White wrote in 1960 that he was supposed to present to the Analytical Psychology Club in London, on the self, he writes, quote, "I may say that this is my very first attempt at anything like a public appearance since, perhaps rather significantly, a gust of wind blew me off my scooter onto my skull and cracked it. And I could not possibly want this first attempt at public speaking to be anywhere else." So he was planning to give his talk there in London, and he referenced the significance that a gust of wind had blown him off his scooter. In that earlier dream that he writes to Jung, you remember they're on a sailboat sailing down the coast from Denmark, I think, down the coast of the Atlantic toward France to the south, and then and then they go inland, and a gust of wind is blowing them along. Nobody's steering the boat, but the gust of wind, Victor White says, was taking care of us and would never harm the two of us. That's a quote from his letter. Then, later in his life, the gust of wind came and knocked him off his scooter. So I think he also recognized that there was some synchronistic connection between those two things. Jung interprets that dream as, well, we're on a dangerous mission. This is dangerous for you because of your position in the Catholic Church, certainly. And the Spirit is guiding us. He says, the Spirit, that's the pneuma, that's the Holy Spirit. So we're being protected at this moment, at least. We're being protected by the divine. And if you would ask then, Jung, well, what do you mean by that? You mean you're really under the protection of God, of a metaphysical God out there who's got his hand over you and is taking care of you? I don't think he would go that far, but I think he would say there's something in the air that is guiding us and protecting us, at least for the time being, so that we aren't going to crash on the rocks. But that would be the Spirit that is enlivening them, that is between them, that's exciting them, that's inspiring them, and is also creating some synchronicities between them. So it might have some transcendent dimensionality to it, and then synchronistically blows Victor White off of his scooter later, and he breaks his head open. That's apparently the wind had changed for Victor White, at least. You could read it that way. I think Victor White saw it somehow as a sign that he needed to open up. He needed to break open his head and start thinking in a different way. Unfortunately, even if he could have recovered from that accident, he couldn't have recovered from his stomach cancer. It wasn't the accident that killed him, but it was. It came very close to the end of his life, synchronistically, or they discovered the cancer shortly after that, and he died within about 6 months. And I guess we'll have to end this on that rather sad note of Victor White's death. Actually, we should also say that Jung died not too long after that period, within 12 months. So the ends of their lives more or less coincided. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the performance, and I'll look forward to seeing it myself. I haven't seen the DVD. I've seen the performance many times, but I hear Karsten did a wonderful job putting that DVD together.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Murray, for this. I know it's time to close because I'm hearing Zurich bells in the background.
Right, 7 o'clock bells.
The Swiss. Well, thank you once again, Dr. Stein. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Paul, you've been playing the role of C.G. Jung now for a couple of years, on and off.
Get used to it.
Yes. What's it like to slip into the persona of C.G. Jung for you?
it was a very special experience, I must say. I discovered through that Jung really much more as a person with a lot of variety of feelings. Perspective I, of course, hadn't before, because I knew him as a writer, as an author.
Now you really get into his skin.
Now you get into his skin and you discover him as a person.
And what's that like?
Well, I felt that he is very close. I come closer to what he must have felt as an individual. With his anger, you can feel rage, his emotions, his emotions, his humor sometimes, his friendly style when he speaks with Victor White, taking him very serious in his and having a lot of respect for him. All these emotional aspects, I didn't know that so immediately, so personal.
Well, people comment that you're very convincing as Sergei Jung. Partly, I think it's because of the accent, the Basler. Can you just say that first line when it opens up your first letter to Victor White? Do you remember how that goes?
Yeah, I start with the date, and this had immediately also a reaction I have here, perhaps. I don't remember the
exact date.
5th of October, 1945.
That's and the audience immediately reacts to that guttural sound.
I mean, it's amazing how the accent he uses in his English is very pronounced. I heard that in Face to Face with Professor Jung, or in other movies we have from him. It's a very pronounced, very articulate, very typical Basel dialect. And at the same time, I was amazed about the richness of his vocabulary. He's a very... the English is perfect for my...
Very good English, yes.
But at the same time, the way is not very English. I mean, it's very much the person from Basel speaking.
And you're communicating with an Englishman, of course, Victor White, and there's a moment there where you say that he can call you Sergei, and he comes back with dear CG, and again the audience finds that contrast of linguistic styles, I guess, or accents is a very important part of this, I think, to establish your identities. Very Swiss. Jung is very Swiss and very Basel.
It seems that the CG, how he wanted to be called by him, was the way also how in the family he was called.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was called the CG.
Nobody called him Carl? Or?
No, apparently not. At least I heard that.
My meager paucity. Well, in the... You've studied Jung for a long time, and reading these letters must have been quite an experience. In the performance, are there particular moments, particular letters that you find especially outstanding or moving as you perform the role?
There is in the beginning, in particular, one letter I'm still, when I play it again, I'm very moved by it, where he speaks about a dream he had, a very impressive dream with a blue diamond star in heaven.
That's after he's had a illness or heart
attack. And also the fact that he refers there to Victor White's prayers, saying that he enjoys the fact to feel included in the prayers of him. I was amazed about this open religious language. It's a new aspect I didn't know from Jung. And this letter where he is so directly, personally showing a deep inner experience with this dream, and what it meant that he felt contained in something bigger, and that's one important moment in the whole series.
Yes.
And also when in the end it's sad and tragic, but at the same time beautiful to see that he thanks Victor White for all what he has learned in the conversation with him.
The
very last
letter. Yeah.
That's very moving after all what they had gone through before, with a lot of misunderstanding and struggling together.
Yes.
Kind of deep, calm, peaceful, friendly.
Yes. Well, you remember when we made the selection of these letters, we read through them all together, and we sorted them, we discussed and debated, and there are a lot of very long and complicated letters that we decided not to include in the performance. It just wouldn't be appropriate for this kind of a staged setting. But in reading the letters and then in performing them, after having studied Jung for 30 years or so, I think probably by now you've been at this profession and study. Was there anything in these letters that you learned new about Jung that came out as a kind of revelation or a new angle, a new?
It's mainly something new concerning him as a person, not so much the theory, all thoughts he develops in the discussion with Victor White. I was quite familiar with, but to see him referring so openly to his belief or to his Christian faith several times, this was a new element in my view of Jung. I didn't know that.
Do you think that developed in him later in life? In his autobiography, he says he was without a myth. Christianity wasn't his myth. He really had left behind his Protestant upbringing and so on, and needed to discover something new for himself. And then in these letters, I had the same feeling. There is this strong Christian element, maybe because he's speaking to a priest, but
in part for sure, but I think also it's his life situation, probably also he's facing illness and death, and I think that can have also caused a more personal statement. He is not as careful to make clear that he is not a theologian,
a
scientist to make that sure. He seems to be beyond that, given also the fact that it's private correspondence with a friend and a colleague. But I think also it's because he's closer to the end of his own life. And
are there any points where you've become critical of Jung? If being in Jung's skin, you would have done it differently.
There is one clear moment in the whole exchange of letters. It's when Victor White is in a very desperate moment, complaining about his situation, doubting if he should continue as Dominican priest or leave the order. In a very moving way, he explains his situation, and you would then, in the next letter written by Jung, expect more empathy. But the letter he writes, then Jung, seems to, for my taste, quite distant. He speaks not so much about the personal individual situation of Victor White, but more what is needed for the church in general. So he's more referring to the great cause than to the individual situation of the person, Victor White.
And you would have done that differently.
I would have done that differently.
Yeah, more humane,
yeah.
empathic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's really interested in the more general
I think
situation.
many people had that complaint about him.
Yeah.
I think that he was not so personally connected. He was more into the impersonal and the big picture.
Yeah,
was his
but I was nevertheless surprised in a later letter. Victor White is referring to that response of Jung, and mentioning with big help of. He refers to the I Ching he had done,
that's right.
and also with the help of your answer. So he didn't consider that as probably as so destructive or out of place, but as a kind of a helpful way.
Maybe it helped him remain a priest. Maybe he really was a priest. I mean, he died with God on his lips. I think his last words were supposed to be "Take me, God," or something along those lines. He was a faithful priest to the end of his life. There's no question about that. And maybe Jung saw that.
Yeah, perhaps he looked through more in depth the situation. But there I felt a kind of a difference, human part. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for sharing your reflections and your feelings as Tae-Ge Jung. It's been very. I had no problem to come back to Paul.
That was not a problem. Okay, Paul, you're now Paul. Heike.
Hello, Maury.
Analyst, psychiatrist. What's it like to be an actress?
It's a very, very strange feeling. It has come to me like an attack.
An attack?
An attack, yes. More than 2 years ago for the anniversary from Jung's death day, the 6th June. Somebody from the program commission phoned me and said, Heike, we have an attack on you and you cannot refuse. And I was very shocked. And then I said, what's happening? Yeah, we would like that you play the anima. And I said, why are you playing the anima? Doing what? And then she was laughing and she said, we would just like that you read some letters from a feminine figure, which was important between Carl Gustav Jung and Victor White. And then she was telling me about the book from Anne Lammers, and that she wished that I participate with you and Paul Broche and John Hill and Anne to work out a line of letters which could make a piece to present it to public, interested public. And so I was a bit shocked and I thought, does it mean acting? And she said, no, you just have to read some letters. And then,
Well, she didn't really know what it would become
either. Nobody knew.
Nobody
knew. And so
and
I
how
was
it
saying
grew,
yes. And I was telling her, I worked so many years not to play the anima anymore for people, and to become a more integrated woman,
professional
woman, and my being. And we were laughing both. We knew what it means. And then she said, perhaps you have integrated enough this part, and now you can be very free to play with it.
Well, how was it with no experience as an actress, no training, to step into something like that? How did you do it?
I didn't knew in the beginning, so I was beginning to make this work with letters and constructing this piece. And then the first time when we were showing it in the Helferei in Zurich, I was sitting in the middle between John and Paul, and I felt rather clumsy. And I was making my duty, fulfilling my duty.
Yeah, that was the first performance.
It was the first performance, and I thought, now it will be over, and was very happy, and it's done. And then after the play, the president of the London Institute came. How was her name again?
Esther Salomon.
Esther Salomon, yes, sorry. And she was saying, you were playing all fantastic, I invite you to London. And so I felt, oh my God, it will go on. I have to do it a second time. London Theatre. And yes, I was more afraid than really happy.
Yeah.
And then we were practicing some months after the first time.
Well, you worked hard. You really practiced.
Yeah, then I realized I have to learn it by heart.
Yeah.
Because sitting between the two guys and just reading was feeling very clumsy. And when I was practicing at home, I realized that I was standing and talking to my two little rabbits and acting, walking around in the living room. And when you came to my place to practice it all together, I was telling you this, and you were all agreeing.
Yeah, yeah.
And from this time on, I learned
then it became
the
a
text
kind
by
of
heart.
dance. Your
Yes,
body is
yes.
into it. It speaks.
And when I was a young girl and very young woman, I practiced dance, ballet dance, and just dance. And so it was a help to have this body feeling.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a basic. But theater, I never have done theater, not at school,
Yeah,
never, and I never wanted to.
You're a natural.
It's, came to me.
Very, very well done. And in doing this role, it's not a big role in the performance, but I think a very central one. How do you estimate the importance of Barbara Robb in the relationship of these two men, and also in how we went about putting this whole thing together? You're a very important figure. Sora Mystica.
Yes, and the first time when I was being in this role, I was more in my ego, so to say, to speak technically. And normally I don't like to speak like this, but to make it shorter. And then I had the feeling, it's not so important, and I was even in my presentation hiding.
Yeah.
And then Anne Lammers, who is a very nice person, I began to like her very much through our project. She was helping me to practice because she has some experience as a singer. And she said, Heike, you have to not to think that you have no importance. And then I was going more into the story of these three people, Victor White, Jung, and Barbara Robb, and in the piece itself. And I felt, at the moment when she appears, before she appears, Jung is ill.
Yes,
was ill in his heart attack, and she comes in when both men go into a deeper step of their relationship.
That's right, yeah.
And a lot of synchronicities are happening, and the anima is bringing both sides together. There's sufferance and hope and a new path. So the two poles of an anima, the dark and the light, is present.
And there's such moving letters that she writes to Victor White in her active imaginations. There are prayers for Jung, and then her lengthy active imagination. In that material, do you find special moments that move you, that touch you?
Yes, more and more when I play the role, there is this scene where Barbara is having the vision that she is on a rope with Carl Gustav Jung, and there is this vibration between them, and they are taken from an energy of love. And I realized the more I play this scene, the more and more I'm overwhelmed from feelings, deep emotions, not sadness, neither happiness. It's a deep being taken from, it's a love feeling, but a very, not a sentimental feeling, a very big, overwhelming feeling. And the last two times I was near to cry. Tears wanted to come up, and I felt this vibration. It was really very, very taking. And I'm not an actress. I thought you cannot cry. And but I must say, since we played in London, behind the curtain, for some seconds I forgot my text when I was waiting to come on the scene. And then the voice was saying, Heike, it's not about you. You're just the instrument to give words to Barbara and to show how important the anima is between all the people, and even until today. And then my text was coming back.
Must be a little scary for a moment.
And it was terrible. I was sweating, and I had no papers with me. I was just with nothing behind the curtain, and it was a terrible moment. But then it changed to a deep humility, and I was feeling like a servant.
You served the role.
I served the role. I served this friendship to show the people how deep this friendship was, and what they had to say to the world.
So I think you had some of the experience of what must happen to actors and actresses regularly, that they lose themselves in a sense in the role. I mean, that it comes out of another part of their psyche, not out of their ego.
Yes.
They've learned the lines so well, and now it can just spontaneously happen to them.
What is synchronistically very interesting in my personal life, that since I play Barbara Robb, I met more actors.
Oh,
and
yes.
even on a very personal level, and I could exchange with them. I've never asked, but it came to explanations. They witnessed their experiences, and I was astonished how many parallels I could find.
And you could empathize with them.
Yes, and it's really a process, a psychological process, which is going on since I'm doing this, and it has an impact in my private life. As a psychotherapist, I love my work a lot, and I do it since more than 25 years, very intensely. And I already had the feeling that I serve the soul somehow.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
But through this role, and more than the role, more the energy of what comes out, and parallel to the coming out of the Red Book, when I opened the Red Book, I was also overwhelmed, like in the scene where there is this vibration between Jung and Barbara Robb. There is this deep feeling of love for the soul and a readiness to be able for discipline to work for the soul. It's very difficult to put in words, but it's a very deep thing.
Well, it sounds like it's been very important for you personally.
Yeah, I think it was
get into this,
synchronicity that came to me in a moment which was not easy in my life, when I was asked to do this role, and it's a challenge for a higher level or deeper level of individuation.
Yes,
and for love.
And what have been some of the side effects of this? You mentioned to me sometimes you're seen as people know you on stage now. They don't know you as a psychotherapist or an analyst.
Yes. Sometimes I made a joke and I said it will be the special. I say it very funny, a special bimbo of the Jungians.
Please.
because some friends were laughing and very nice, but all very gentle.
Yeah.
Because I thought, my God, we have colleagues, they really were actresses, and they could have chosen a real actress, a very good actress, because I don't feel good. I feel more taken by it, but I don't feel as an actress.
Yeah.
And I will not do other pieces.
This isn't the beginning of a new career.
Only role in my life, beside the personas I'm trying to fulfill.
But if people see you on the street and say, Barbara.
Not on the street, but it was really happening in the Congress of German of the German Jungians in Berlin, that one colleague I didn't knew personally came to me in the entrance hall and was saying, "Hello, Barbara, how do you do?" And I took some minutes to explain to him that I'm not Barbara.
That you're not Barbara.
And he was not knowing my name.
Well, you don't have trouble stepping out of the role, I would assume, though. I mean, going back into your life after you've played the role.
It's too small. It's more as a therapist, as a Jungian, that I feel this process which has come into my life, which has has given a peace to my life.
Yes.
And I have the feeling, if I may say, to all of us who are participating, when I speak with Paul or John, or observing them, or you, in Anne, the exchange I had with Anne, it has not led us without change.
No, absolutely. And I've seen the performance so many times now in rehearsals and and the real performances, but every time I'm moved, and especially by your that active imagination, exactly what you're talking about, that rope scene and what comes out of that, and seeing it from above and it's turned into a circle.
Yes. And when it's at the end, the mandala, which the arena has become like a flower.
Yes.
This is a very, very deep moment. And I had the feeling also that there was something in the audience happening. Also, at the end of the piece, where Victor White and Carl Gustav Jung have this last exchange, it's very moving, that after their deep exchange and even conflicts, deep conflicts, they could maintain this deep friendship.
Yes.
And for me, this is a sign of this power of the anima, which was there, the power of love, of linking, always creating relations. That is, we can feel this and experience this when we look at the piece or when we are playing in it.
It's very interesting.
And
yeah.
I think also it has it's doing something to the outside.
Yeah.
When I see the success that we were invited to so many different places, we have to go to Montreal to perform again, and it's very touching.
Yes.
And I think it's more than our or my talent of acting. It's what is the message behind.
Yes.
And this deep energy of relation.
Yeah.
And this is one very important aspect of the anima. Of
Well, I'm sure people are so thankful that you've put yourself into this in the way you have and really brought the figure to life and the performance to life.
Yes, and I think thankful that I could do it. I had so many resistances, and I could grow in passing, overcoming, or understanding these resistances, and it made me grow, and it still does. It makes me having nice friendships.
Yes,
deepening the friendships
I think we
with
have
my colleagues.
Gotten to know each other very well through all this. Thank you, Heike.
Thank you,
been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
John.
Hi, Murray. Good to be with you.
Actor.
Yes.
Jungian analyst, actor. What is it like for you to slip into this role? I've watched you in operation for a couple of years now, but for you, what's it like stepping out of your persona as John Hill, Jungian analyst, and going into this?
It's something like a regression. Now, I studied scholastic philosophy for 4 years.
I see.
Right. And so I know that world. In fact, when I read Victor White's Jung and the God and the Unconscious, I, from that book, knew I had to study Jungian psychology. Right? And it was like a breaking away from that purely conceptual approach, philosophical approach to reality. So it was on one hand the old world, but it also constellated memories of liberation. So it was, for me, it was a wonderful opportunity to look again at my scholastic training, to see its relationship to Jungian psychology, and there's something like a priest inside of me.
It certainly comes out.
Yes,
with your collar.
For better or for worse, right? It comes out. And so to kind of confront the great Jung as a priest was very interesting.
Well, do you imagine the scenes at Blackfriars in Oxford as you're writing those letters, that you're sitting at a desk there somewhere?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's not quite the scholasticism that I learned. It's more Irish, but my son is in Oxford, so I've visited several times Blackfriars. And so I just know what the whole atmosphere is like.
Well, in the course of the performance, I think Anne in her narrative says that Victor White really suffered. He was a broken man. I think she uses that phrase, a broken man, after a certain his rejection to become the
of course
the head. Do you feel that in the letters, his brokenness?
Oh, absolutely. There's one speech where he's just read the I Ching and he gets the response abysmal. Now, to me, that was the most important speech of the whole role of Victor White, in which he's questioning his whole vocation, in fact, questioning his whole identity, and asking Jung for help. And so he really expresses, and I felt that very much in me, this fall from grace, this descent into the underworld, this loss of identity. And then, from then, I just, I'm pleading to Jung to say, can you put out your hand and help me? I don't know where I'm going. Maybe I have to give up my priestly role and return to the world at 51. Remember what he says?
Yes.
A world for which I'm totally unequipped. So there's the broken moment of the whole role. And I felt it. I really felt it.
But do you think he recovered after that? And he went back to California and he lived for another, 7 or 8 years?
Yes. That's a very good question. Now, I can't really answer that objectively, but in the role, something remained broken. And he actually says that, because he says at the end he's going to return to California, but he feels less at home
Yeah,
as a
yeah.
priest than ever before.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this huge doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently he became a great analyst. I was talking to one of his analysans.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and he said he was so sensitive and so connected, and this analysan didn't know anything about his fame as a theologian. So he remained definitely a Jungian analyst, but probably very sensitive, probably also because of this loss of certainty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you're raised in that system, you're
Yeah.
always looking for certainty.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think finally Jung undid that knot, as it were.
But do you think Jung let him down? Could Jung have helped him? Could he have
That's a
reached
very
out a hand?
good question, and I think there might have been something that Jung could have done. And that is when White asks for help, Jung, in a most uncharacteristic fashion, says, you have to stay a priest.
Mm-hmm.
So Jung becomes directive,
Mm-hmm.
right? Directive at that moment. And then White then is absolutely confirmed. Yes, I'm going to be a priest. The great Jung has said so. I don't know if he said it, if he would accept that so naively, but nevertheless, I think a Jungian approach would be more a question, well, what do you feel about it? What's your inner resources? What's your psyche trying to hear express? I think the role of the analyst would have been to be neutral on that issue, to let something develop out of White's brokenness.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, Jung just crashed in, as it were, and said, no, you must stay a priest.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not analytical.
But do you feel that Jung was his analyst? Should he have been more of an analyst to White?
No, I don't think so. But you see, that's the question. He wasn't. It was very much a kind of academic discussion among scholars.
Mm-hmm.
Very much. That comes out very strongly. But nevertheless, there were analytical moments.
Mm-hmm.
There's quite clearly a transference where I think White sees Jung as a kind of aid, helper, supporter in some way, guide, if you want. So that's more the personal father-son transference.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think there's also a cultural transference in the sense of it's a clash between an emotional attachment, on the one hand, White to the medieval world,
Mm-hmm.
to Aquinas, and Jung an attachment to the Renaissance, to Kant, and to Protestantism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think here this is not about simply two systems clashing. It's about an emotional attachment to two systems that they just couldn't find the bridge.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Jung once said that, if you are outwardly a Catholic, your unconscious is Protestant, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you just have to ask, Jung's sort of directiveness, was that his unconscious Catholicism in talking to White?
Mm-hmm.
Or White's doubt, was that his unconscious Protestantism that was addressing Jung?
Mm-hmm.
And in my view, that cultural transference or counter-transference just was left unexamined.
Mm-hmm.
So they got stuck.
And do you think if they were living today and in our circumstances with what we understand nowadays about transference and counter-transference, they could have gotten past it? Could they have solved the problem?
I think they could have been much more sensitive to what was going on in their unconscious, yes. Whether they could have solved it or not, that I don't... Yes, I would say that was in the potential.
Did they have to get so hung up on privatio boni? I mean...
No. See, that's again, I would say also a matter of... That just enraged Jung, privatio boni. Mm-hmm. And what enraged White was Jung's view of God in Answer to Job. Mm-hmm. And so they were both there on those issues, emotionally stuck.
Yeah.
So they could have, for example, if they would have agreed to a joint project
mm-hmm.
and somehow realize what's going on in their differences and to somehow maybe let, as White suggests in the end, maybe the transcendent function or the reconciling symbol can show a completely new way out of this.
Mm-hmm.
But that seems to not have happened.
Now, White is not very much read and studied these days by Jungians. To my knowledge, his books aren't assigned in courses and in institutes and so on. Do you think there's value there? You've looked at them. Are there essays that would repay us visiting them again and
as a practitioner, I'm not sure, but certainly as Jungian psychology is very much concerned with culture, White has a tremendous knowledge of the medieval ages, particularly of scholasticism. So if you want to take a fresh look at the medieval influence on Jungian psychology, for example, there's treasures there to be found.
I have the feeling that it's overlooked. I think there's a lot there that we could go back to
and also to refine one's thinking about everything, not just Jungian psychology.
He's a good thinker.
Because White is an extremely good thinker. And he's a very sympathetic thinker. He really tries. You can see him, as opposed to maybe a more dogmatic view. He is absolutely willing to put himself in doubt. He tries to make an overture to Jung on several occasions. He's searching for the truth. So his system, although heavily influenced by medieval scholasticism, is open and is, in that sense, empirical. But if somebody comes along and misunderstands the conceptual system of the medieval ages, then he'll say, no, that's not what they're talking about.
And he tried to straighten Jung out a couple of times,
absolutely,
I think.
And then became really bitter about the whole thing.
Now, people who've seen you perform and now watch the performance on DVD really think that your abilities as an actor are extraordinary. That you really bring this character to life. You're very vivid as Victor White. Do you have a background in theater?
Well, I acted in nearly all the school plays. So it was something I really liked. I have a grandfather who had his own troupe and acted, with his various actors for William Butler Yeats in Ireland.
Oh my!
Yeah. So he did that. So the school, and then somehow I kept the flame alight through my training in psychodrama. I never actually acted, but sometimes I would intervene in certain dramatic and sort of saying, look, it could be like this, it could be like that. So that sensitivity to taking on roles has always been part of my life.
Do you enjoy it?
Oh, I love it. It's just great. Yeah, it's like the complexes. They can live for better or for worse, as it were. They can live. They can fight with each other. They can love each other. They can, be bitter about each other, or be disappointed with each other. But that's what the human psyche is about. It's a theatre. And to let these, even in active imagination, you let these various figures speak, and they sometimes tear you apart.
Yes, witness the Red Book.
The Red Book, exactly. And but drama makes something come alive. If there's not a conflict, it gets flat.
Yeah.
But when you really are in conflict with something, then people's attention is alerted. They know, because there's the unexpected. You don't quite know who's going to win or how it's going to come out.
Is there a role that you're dying to play?
Well, now, Murray, that's
After
a difficult...
this?
Yes, well, you kind of suggested we might do the Freud-Jung letters. And you kind of winked at me, and I kind of my eyebrow raised, and well, what about being Freud? I don't know whether I could do that or not. But I did. I couldn't help but that evening look at YouTube to see, well, did Freud speak?
I see.
And so I found a small YouTube document of him speaking English.
Oh, yes.
I wouldn't attempt to do that right now, but it's very different than Jung's accent, Swiss accent.
Yeah.
But it's quite very strong, very strong. I mean,
yeah.
He really rolls his R's and comes across very
well. There's another drama in those letters for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
In which Jung's part is quite different from in
and again, two completely different personalities: the Judaic, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Swiss kind of background, peasant background, and so forth. Clash of cultures, clash of personalities.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your
Murray,
experiences.
thank you very much for those wonderful questions. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be able to say all what I said. Good. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
We are very privileged today to be able to talk to Ann Lammers, who's the editor of the book, The Jung-White Letters, and also the narrator in the play. And Ann, I'm going to ask you, first of all, what it was like for you to step into this role as narrator, particularly after being the editor of the book.
I arrived in Zurich in late May, early June of 2007. And the others in the play had spent months together whittling it down, boiling it down to a manageable text that got across what they wanted to get across out of the book. And then it was up to me to fill in the gaps, because 90 minutes isn't very long, and they had to just select out of the letters the high points. But there's a story going on in the background with these two men. And how do we get from the end of this letter to the beginning of that letter? Maybe there's a year and a half between them, and some important stuff has happened that motivates the next letter being written. So the first thing I did was to write my own part. And I guess what I did was to practice telling a story. And I don't know if I succeeded as well as I want to, but that was what I was aiming to do.
Yes, I remember as you're talking, I remember hearing your presentation out in San Francisco at the history conference at the Jung group.
Yeah, some years ago.
Some years ago,
Right.
and I think that's where you and I met each other.
Yeah, we did. That's right.
And I remember very much your talk out there. And one of the things I remember is that there were actually tears in your eyes.
Yeah.
As you were talking, particularly as you got into
I got to the end of it.
As you got to the end, and
I remember that too.
You remember that too, and it was like that. You have spent so many years with Jung and White, and their letters and their correspondence that you actually, I think, just got very involved and felt very much like a part of this relationship, and you had. I think maybe you might even have said it. You had tears of sadness for these two people, particularly when they went their separate ways. And I'm wondering what it was like for you now in this play. Now it's not just reading letters. Now you have people you have Jung and White almost like here. What was that like emotionally for you, just to be in the presence of actual human beings who were as much like Jung and White as they could get?
As they could, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there have been times during rehearsals when I really listened to them talking to each other and felt it's partly a frustration with them for not listening better to each other at certain points. And it's partly just heartbreak, because in some ways this is a love story. They were really very deeply befriended. They had each confided their private lives to each other. They each knew each other very well. And it was quite painful that they couldn't hold it together. It was partly the result of historical circumstance. White was put under such immense duress by his order that he wasn't fully the master of what he did in 1955. He went off to California in 54, and in early 55, he sent off a scathing review of Answer to Job, which included stuff he later took out. They didn't really mean, but he was so hurt, and he had no way to express it towards his superiors in the order, because he had chosen the path of staying in the order. And he was a very lonely man at that point. He was really a hurt man. So where was he going to express the anger? Well, there was Papa Jung, whose Answer to Job was the cause of all the trouble. Except, of course, it wasn't. It was just one more chapter in what had been already back in 1948 a problem field, a field of trouble between them.
Mm-hmm.
But Answer to Job was the piece of that story that became publicly known and obvious.
Mm-hmm.
And White blamed Jung for his loss of his position. And it was a very hard time. And that's why when Jung says to him, you yourself are in a hell of suffering, he was just telling the truth.
Mm-hmm. Was there particular moments between, in the exchange, in the performance, that you found particularly meaningful or important?
There's the letter that White writes to Jung in 1948, when Jung has commented on White's essay on Gnosticism, and Jung talks about whether he has faith or not. And White seizes on that and says, I'm tempted to comment, I have not found such great faith in Israel, because Jung has talked about his life work. And it moves White very deeply. And it moves him in the sense that it clicks for him spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
He sees that as a confessional statement that Jung has made. I have not found such great faith in Israel. And then, when John Hill, and I don't know how Victor White would have said it, but I know how John Hill says it. John Hill says, St. Anselm's famous formula, I do not seek to understand in order that I may believe. I believe in order that I may understand. Seems to me alone to be able to coordinate faith and knowledge. We were sitting, John Hill and Paul Brucha, Heike Weiss, and I, sitting in a room rehearsing together last September. And just because of the setting we were in and the quietness of the concentration of the rehearsal, when I heard John say those words, I realized this was a very profound moment in White's theological reflection, that he made available to Jung, this theological reflection. And I wanted them to stop and unpack St. Anselm's statement. And, you know, each of them sit there and face to face confess to each other where that hit them.
Mm-hmm.
That was an extremely moving moment to me.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing how much their conversation mattered to both of them, I thought, oh, here was a place, if they had had time, if they'd been able to be together more.
Yeah. Yeah.
If they'd lived in the same community, maybe they could have taken that apart. Could Jung have agreed to that, I believe, in order that I may understand? Maybe not. Maybe not at all. But why he couldn't believe in order that he may understand? Maybe he could have made White understand that. What was temperamentally or philosophically wrong with that for him.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, just hearing John Hill say it moved me deeply.
Yeah, yeah. There's a part of you that wanted these two men to,
I wanted them
to work out their relationship.
I wanted them to work it out. Yeah, I really did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really did.
Yeah, I can feel that. That's good.
And
yeah.
the other part I've already mentioned, the letter that that Jung writes in 1955, when he's received White's letter from the Queen Mary, and White has already sent in that fatal book review. And Jung says, you yourself are profoundly emotional about it. You could not make anybody believe that you're not in a hell of suffering. And then he says, and this again, it's Paul Brucha, listening to Paul Brucha read this, say this. Who knows how Jung would have done it? I know how Paul does it.
Mm-hmm.
There is no comfort and no consolation anywhere except in the submission to and the acceptance of the self. Or you may call it the God that suffers in his own creation. Jung is right in the center, right in the core of the theological, the Christian answer to evil in that statement.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't necessarily the core of answer to Job, but talking to a friend, he's right in the middle of theodicy. For me, based on theological study that I've done, that's as deep as it gets.
Mm-hmm.
That we don't get to know why evil is in the world and why people suffer. What we get to know is that God is suffering too.
Mm.
The God who suffers in his own creation.
Wow. That was from Jung's letter.
Jung wrote that.
Yeah, Jung wrote that.
And that's one of those places where he reveals a kind of genius for theology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or pastoral theology.
Mm-hmm.
There's something for you.
There you go. Do you have a quick answer to why you feel the relationship didn't work out?
Why the relationship did? It's like looking at a marriage that fails. You don't always get to have a quick answer to that.
Yeah. So there's no quick answer to that.
There were several layers of things going on, and some of it was human finitude in its raw form. When, in 1955, when White came back to Switzerland and said, all right, let's have it out, Jung agreed to meet with him. But it was never going to be possible to have it out right then. Emma Jung had just had an operation and was dying.
Mm.
Her cancer was not fixable, and she was not going to live much longer. And Jung was dealing with that existential fact. At the same time that White shows up ready to go to the mat and wrestle with him on theological and, in some sense, political issues.
Mm-hmm.
One of White's issues with Jung at that point was, why did you publish it?
Mm.
You made things so difficult for people like me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, don't you realize I'm struggling to get a Catholic readership for you, and you had to go and publish that? It was okay. It was okay to write it.
Yeah.
It was okay to show it to your best friends. But then why did you have to put it out there in the world where people are forced to write book reviews?
Yeah, right, right. Was there particular things that you learned about Jung or White from being in the performance?
I really think it comes down to what I've learned from listening to those voices. Paul Bruce is so funny. His comic timing is so good.
Mm-hmm.
And his Basler accent is so thick.
Mm.
I feel as though I've been in the presence of Jung and White, alive, present in the room with me. And that's a kind of learning.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm fond of them in a way I might not have been before.
Mm-hmm.
Or I feel I know what they really sound like in my ear.
Mm-hmm. They really have a flesh to them now. I mean,
They
really
do. They're
really,
three-dimensional,
yeah.
warm-blooded people
Mm-hmm.
to me.
Yeah, yeah. So that's something very
Well, you know
new,
what? You know what that is. It isn't discursive knowledge. It isn't fact.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know facts about Jung and White that I didn't know before. It's affective knowledge. And Victor White would like that because he wrote a series of 3 or 4 long essays on the affective knowledge of God.
Mm.
This is heart knowledge. This is Kennen. It's not Wissen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As we wrap up our little conversation now, and is there anything else that you would like to share about the performance, about the play, or about your part in it, or about anything that you experienced that you just would like others to know about?
Well, yeah, I want to thank. Now that sounds sort of canned, but I do. I want to thank the audiences. I want to thank people for coming and listening, for watching closely, for responding with questions. This play won't quit. People keep wanting to see it.
Mm-hmm. You have made a rich contribution to Jungian psychology, and I want to thank you very much, and I appreciate very much, and I'm sure everybody that's watching this appreciates very much all the hard work you have done.